Pat Dodson, thank you very much for welcoming us here.
Thank you very much for coming.
We didn't hear much from you at all after the failure of The Voice. Many Indigenous leaders retreated for a while. Tell me how you experienced that loss.
I empathised with them. I felt the sadness. I didn't want to make judgments about the composition of the vote or the responses to the provision as such. I thought time will heal this, and we will need to come back and look at a way forward, because the country's integrity, its pride, its future relationship with First Peoples is not going away. It'll remain, and we're going to have to pick up that battle despite the scarring we may have experienced out of it, and the hurt and the pain. But that's been the course of life for many of us, and I think really it was a time to reflect and not just look at the superficial analysis of why these things happen, but try to look, for me anyway, to look at what the structural foundations are, because we've been at this process now for a long time, over 30 years or so in a formal sense, and we've had reports upon reports, and we've had clarity on many fronts about substantive issues, and yet we saw a response at the poll that I think shocked many of us, and many people felt gutted, I think.
Do they want to come back? Are they prepared to take the risk again to come back and face the possibility of disappointment?
Well, I don't see any alternatives. We're not the majority of this country, and we saw that. But we do hurt, and we do feel the pain, and we've got to revise where our energies go. But if you don't participate, you'll end up being the subject and the property of the assimilationist. And you'll go down a track that's totally about assimilation. If you looked at what they were talking about in the opposition at the last election, getting rid of land councils, revising a whole range of symbolism, throw out the welcome to country, get rid of the flags, rescind the ambassador. So anything that indicates the presence of Aboriginal people would have gone. That's what the new assimilation's about, is completing the obliteration of Aboriginal people from the landscape. Cultural heritage is another very important aspect of that. The more you smash and destroy the cultural heritage of Aboriginal people, the greater it is to say, well, there's no substantive argument to say that they had any presence here, because there's no evidence there, because you've blown it up.
Let me talk about the politics then, because what we observed after the failure of The Voice was the Prime Minister and his government appear to retreat almost completely from Indigenous affairs, from policy. I'm not saying there was still business going on, of course, but in a leadership sense, it was void. Obviously, they've just had this huge victory. What do you expect from them now? What should be their next step on reconciliation?
They've got to go back and revisit the Yawuru statement from the heart. That doesn't mean they have to go down the constitutional path for a voice, but it does mean they've got to honour the two aspects, or the Makarrata Commission. That wasn't voted upon by the people. That wasn't part of the provision that we all voted on to vote down. So they've got to go back to the treaty-making process and the truth-telling process. So, and they can do that because it doesn't require a constitutional referendum. That can be done by way of legislation.
Let's pull those things apart just for a minute. So you think you're saying the Albanese government should move forward on truth-telling and treaty with Australia's Indigenous people?
Absolutely, and with the Australian public, because the truth-telling is got to be a two-way street. We've got to listen to stories that we don't know about that others have got. And we've got to find a way where they're comfortable enough to tell those stories, and where we can aggregate the stories through respect for the perspectives and distill from them a national narrative, rather than the one that Captain Cook came here and no one was here.
Do you think that Anthony Albanese has the leadership in him on this issue to do that? Do you have faith that he could do it?
I'm very confident he can do it. I think this is the one thing that the Labor Party is different to the Liberals upon. They remember things. And Albanese, you will remember the late Yunupingu, who talked to him about the fire stick dreaming. And that correlates to the light on the hill that the Labor Party understands. And that was entrusted to him, to carry that fire stick, to bring about the kind of reconciliation and healing that this nation needs. Now, he can't drop that.
Do you think that that election win gives him enough political space to do this?
Absolutely, and particularly if he's looking at or the Labor Party's looking at another term and potentially a third term. Well, you know, they've got to build now. Start now, set up the Makarrata Commission, because it'll take time for all of these things to work through, and so there's no rush. No one's going to be hoodwinked here. The public will understand what these things are about. They'll understand its limitations and its potentialities. They'll understand the substantive issues far clearer than they do at the moment. So
now,
we've got opportunity here.
You've lived through so many unfulfilled promises. You danced at the ceremony when Bob Hawke came to talk about treaty. You've seen promises made and promises broken. What makes you think that it's possible that you could still see this in your lifetime, that this won't be another, that request of Yunupingu to the Prime Minister will not be another broken promise? Because
I think that the government's come back with a resounding victory. The horror that they anticipated passed by. They've now got the confidence of the Australian people. The Australian people want to see unity, they don't want to see hatred, and they want to live with a national sense of its own pride. The time has come. We can't keep kicking it down the road. And even the Prime Minister was saying during the referendum, if not now, when, you know? So, okay, the referendum went up, it went down. That doesn't mean that's the end of reconciliation. Reconciliation is about these substantive issues.
Just coming back to what should happen now, so you talk about, you say the Albanese government should move forward with truth-telling and with treaty to stay with that sequence that was laid out so clearly. On the practical side, should they also endorse the idea of local and regional voices that Marcia Langton and Tom Calmer spent so much time and effort
I think
laying out?
I think they'd be wise to do that. I mean, whether they call it a voice or whether they call it a regional assembly or whatever, but an entity. And that entity will have to be representative of the local regional people. It'll need to have access to good data from the governments, because that's one of the things that kills them, because they don't know what the budgets are or the projected outlays are in a region. They need to have a monitoring system that can see who's responsible for the outcomes in relation, and they need to be able to set priorities. And they're accountable then to the people. And in that way we can start to manage the awful incarceration rates of young people and the underlying circumstances that's giving rise to that, the housing and the health and the lack of education, the lack of training and employment. You know, at a regional level you can try to do that, particularly if you get the collaboration of the other parties, not just of Aboriginal people.
One of the other seminal moments in your career was the Royal Commission into Deaths in Custody. As you just said, we are in a situation now where more, not fewer, Indigenous people are being incarcerated. How do you explain that failure in that period of time? All of the work was done in that Royal Commission to speak about what was wrong in the area of incarceration, and yet here we are in a situation that is even worse.
Well, it's easy to say that the recommendations weren't implemented, and we've had that argument up and down the ladder. The reality is, young kids break the law, and there's domestic violence. There's all sorts of dysfunctional things in some of these communities. There's a lot of positives. So we've got to take responsibility, and then the people have got to be given back responsibility where that's taken from them. If an agency can come in and take your kids away because they think that the child's at risk, and you've got no real comeback, and because you're in poverty or you're affected by drugs or alcohol, well, you've got to do something about that situation. And those people have got to take some responsibility themselves. The government's not going to solve all of that. You've got to take responsibility for your own destinies here. And they can be supported. But the leadership there is in that domain. But if we don't focus on the youth and their future and find innovative ways to dealing with the challenges that they're faced with and the circumstances that are leading them into breaking the law and committing crime and getting into detention centres, then the future of Aboriginal people is going to be very bleak.
What happens then when someone like Senator Jacinta Price says that there are no impacts of colonialisation? Do you understand how she arrives at that point of view?
I don't know how that view could be sustained in the light of the historical truth and the facts. And if it is true, then it can be improved. Because if it's so great and so good to have been colonised, why are we seeing the awful situations that we do see now? Poverty, drug abuse, violence, all of these manifestations she seems to have a concern about, which is fine. But if we'd been benefited, we wouldn't be in that position.
I think about your, I mean, we're here in Broome. I think about your parents, clearly courageous, feisty people. Your grandfather was also an extraordinary man. How would you describe to them the Australia that you are living in now compared to the one that they lived in?
I think now is a time for listening more closely to these waves, to the wind, to the environment, to see how the leaves move and don't move and the animals that live there, to discern what it is that's happening. Because it's not as blatant as it was back in their day. You were told, you were cajoled, you were put in chains, or you were whipped, or you were just denied and refused. It's a lot more subtle. And its long-term intent isn't as clear. If the long-term intent is not, and they could see the long-term intent meant you were dragged away from your culture, from your language, from your families, from your country. Now, a lot of people don't see that these days because they're modern. They live in a modern world, and they're caught up with aspirations that come from a modern world, and they may not have never lived under the duress and the harshness of the reality of dictators or little demigods in communities. But they know about it. And they know there's an injustice there that's happened to one or other of their previous family. And until those wounds are healed, they're going to continue to remember those things. So we've got to know our history, we've got to know the dynamics that lead us in one way or another, and we've got to take responsibility to try and shape it to go in the direction we want it to go in.
Pat Dodson, thank you very much indeed for talking to me.
Thank you, Sarah.